We'll start with some important language about data sets, which begins with cases and variables. First of all, the cases are the units, also sometimes referred to as the individuals in a data set. This is who we have information about. Not always people, but if your study involves people, it's very likely that your cases are the people involved in the study. A variable is any characteristic that is recorded for each case. So to best understand this, it's going to be helpful to look at an example. So let's go into Blackboard. In our course in Blackboard, you find that if you go to week 1, in section 1.1, we have the results of our student demographic survey at the bottom. Clicking on that opens up the Google Sheet with a summary of the results. And we can look through this data set. We know that each response was from a student, so the students in this class are the cases. This timestamp here, I'm not going to consider a variable. This is an identifier, and this is just something to help me organize the data. You'll notice that these rows that we're looking at right now correspond to spring of 2018. This spreadsheet will eventually just represent students in your class. Once I have enough students in from the current semester, I will delete the results from previous semesters, and timestamp helps me to keep track of that. So the cases are the students in the class, and the variables are these words here that are in bold. So, starting with gender, that would be a variable for a student, and gender is either male or female. Birthday full is a little bit tricky because this one is really used to calculate two different values. I used it to calculate age, and I also used it to calculate birthday. Birthday full itself we may not really use other than having used it to calculate these two other variables. So we'll address birthday full when we start listing all of the variables, but in general each of these headings is a variable. So our cases are the students. In particular, they are students in this class. And a few of the variables are gender, age, birthday, etc. We can stop there. An important distinction to make here about language is that we know gender can be broken down into male and female. These are referred to as levels of the variable called gender. If we refer to them collectively, we might say that we're describing a variable. Male versus female is a variable. Male is not a variable. Female is not a variable. These are levels of the variable called gender. So anytime we're asking about what a variable is, we want to make sure we're getting the more broad heading, not an individual value that that variable might take on. Now you might notice by looking at these that these variables don't all behave in exactly the same way. Age would be described by a number, right? Whereas gender would be described as either male or female. This distinction is what we're going to get into next, which is quantitative versus categorical variables. So a categorical variable is one that is defined by categories, and a quantitative variable is one that's defined by numbers. For the most part, it's obvious which is which, but there are a few trickier cases. So if we look back at our data set, gender is pretty obviously a categorical variable. Age is pretty obviously a quantitative variable. To look at a less obvious example, let's come over to zip. These zip codes are numbers, and so our first instinct might be to say that that is quantitative. But if the numbers don't have a real numeric meaning, And a good test of that is you can ask yourself, would it really make sense for me to subtract one zip code from another, for example? Would the result of 16 be meaningful? And I would say probably not in the case of zip codes, that even though these are numbers, they represent geographical regions, and therefore it really is a categorical variable. Another tricky one here would be birthday full, because you could interpret that either way. A birthday is certainly something that could be considered categorical, but it's not very useful to have a categorical variable in which you would not expect to have more than one of your cases taking on the same value, right? These with the year are spread out so much that it would be unlikely to have two students in the same class that have the same birthday including the same year. So as a full birth date including the year, it's probably better to use as a quantitative variable. The way that this could be quantitative, you get from how spreadsheets actually store dates. The way dates are stored in a spreadsheet is the number of days that have passed since January 1st of the year 1900. So it's usually a fairly big number if we're talking about modern dates. Maybe it's something like 3,165,000 something, right? So they are numbers, and we can use them in comparisons a little bit better that way. But that said, age is probably going to substitute in better anywhere that we would be inclined to use birthday full as a quantitative variable. So what I'd like to do is just not use this one as a variable and think of it instead as a question that populates both age and birthday. Both age and birthday are filled in as formulas to be calculated directly from birthday full. So we're going to ignore birthday full when we get to making our list of variables. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start listing the categorical variables. We have gender, which we've already established as categorical. And we also have age, which we have already established as quantitative. Go ahead and pause the video at this point, go through the spreadsheet and try to get all of these variable names in the correct column, and then compare your list to mine when you're done. Okay, so as I mentioned, most of these are pretty straightforward. Zip we have to be careful about because even though it's numeric, it is really numbers that represent categories. Tattoos is one that actually could be treated either way also. If we look back at that tattoos variable for a moment, the way the data are recorded certainly does seem to be categorical. And so just on the surface of it, I would call it categorical. But that said, this could definitely be changed into a numeric scale if it were helpful to do that. None would be considered 0. 1 or 2 small we might call 1, right? We might use the number 2 for several and the number 3 for my body is covered in them, or we might even choose a different scale that we felt like the numbers really represent how we feel about it on a scale of 1 to 10. A categorical variable like this that is what we call ordinal, where the categories themselves follow a particular order, sometimes has to be treated a little bit differently from a categorical variable that is not. Looking at a graph, we want to make sure that the graph is displayed in the right order, for example, right? There's all sorts of reasons why we might do that with the variable tattoos, but on the surface of it, it certainly is categorical. Looking under quantitative, most of these are quite straightforward. This number, I don't really consider this to be a variable at all, but that might not be obvious going through the spreadsheet. I did say that these headings we would all treat as variables. This was thrown into the survey just so that we could use it for some other things that we'll talk about when we get into random samples and the idea of randomness. This isn't really a variable that we would consider to represent the individual or the case, right? This is just going to be used for other purposes. The only other one that might require a little bit of attention is birthday. I would consider that, once we've stripped it of the year, I would tend to consider that categorical, because we're likely to ask questions that maybe have to do with being born in the same month, or even having the same birthday, or the same zodiac sign, or something like that. The way that that's likely to be used is as a categorical variable. But certainly it is possible to use it as a quantitative variable if what we want to address is how far into the year, right? How far into the year somebody was born, how long after January 1st, if there were some reason to look for an association there with some other variable. But in the absence of any additional information, I would consider that to be categorical.